When we think of getting better at climbing on really small holds, normally the first thing that comes to mind is jumping on a fingerboard or campus boarding, or basically any of the really basic physical stuff on the fingers.
I'm here today to try and explain to you a slightly lesser known alternative means to functioning well on small crimps.
A term that's been thrown around a lot is this vacuum style of climbing, which is what you're using to function really well on small holds. Can you tell us what vacuum style climbing is and how those mechanics work?
Yeah, so I feel fundamentally the main objective of climbing this style is to maintain your center of mass as close to the wall as possible, so you come underneath the holds to make them feel as positive as they can be. So most conventional means of training for small holds would have a finger first approach, but we're actually going to approach it slightly differently today. So initially we're going to focus on our hips, then our shoulders, and then finally our fingers. So you might be wondering where hips come into play when functioning on small holds. It's a really key element in getting our weight close to the wall is flexibility in our hips and also strength throughout the ranges of motion. So today we're going to run through 3 exercises that could increase your flexibility and also that mobility and strength.
So Aidan's go-to stretch for opening up the hips is the frog. I think it's pretty obvious why this one's quite good for climbing, because you can get your hips close to the wall. Basically, the deeper your hips go, the further they can get to the wall. Aidan's frog is ridiculously good. And I think it'd be quite nice to go for a variation of this, which I think is really helpful for people which don't have very flexible hips and they want to build that initial flexibility. The issue of this one is there's some friction in the floor, and so that the more friction you have, the harder it is to relax into a stretch, because it basically pushes you back into it. So I'll get Aidan to flip around and go into what I call like the supine frog. And so what you want to do is have your hips away from the wall to a certain point where you have still that 90-degree bend in the knee. And here you can let the hips drop open. Aidan's obviously still ridiculously flexible here, but let's just imagine he's more up here. And now you don't have the friction of the floor stopping your knees from sliding out. And what I would suggest, if you're really tight and you need a bit of assistance into the stretch, because gravity alone, let's face it, is not going to give you a very intense stretch, I would get Aidan to place some weight on his knees. And this you can progressively overload, more weight, more time under tension, making the stretch more intense, so eventually you end up with a frog that looks more like Aidan's. For this exercise, it's a passive stretch, so generally you're looking at a long time under tension because it's not a really high intensity exercise, so 90 seconds to 2 minutes in this position, and you can repeat that 3 times. You also want to make sure that the weight is giving you a decent enough intensity in the stretch. That's probably the key thing to get right here. These are 5 kilos either side, but actually if you've got quite muscular legs and you're really tight, I think you can easily build up to 10 kilos on each leg just to get the intensity into that stretch.
Next up is the weighted pancake. I've been doing these quite a lot over the past few years and find them really good for strengthening the adductors throughout the range of motion.
So I absolutely love the weighted pancake as an exercise, particularly for boulderers, because there's a huge amount of hamstring flexibility required for this, which means those high or far away heel hooks are going to be opened up, more accessible when you get good at an exercise like this. Obviously, Aidan's got a weight here and he's doing what I'd call a tempo stretch. So he's moving in and out of that range of motion slowly. It means the intensity can be quite high for that end range. That's why he's going to feel like he's building strength there as well in that deep position.
So I'm using 5 kilos today. The weight is quite sensitive because the higher the weight, the deeper it will like pull you into the stretch. But it's a bit of a balancing act because too much weight and it's quite easy to force yourself into a position which is quite unnatural and overstretch. So yeah, it's worth starting with no weight initially and gradually incrementally build up to get the intensity right.
So the keen eye will have noticed that Aidan is pretty good at the pancake fold. This is not going to be the easiest position for a lot of people. In fact, you'll find that if you don't have very good hamstring flexibility, you'll pretty much be stuck in an upright position, like unable to fold forwards. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change your orientation to gravity. So go from seated to standing, and we have a spectrum in between there. But the first place to start is standing position. So we'll start up here. If Aidan takes a straddle stance, so opens legs about a step away from the wall and then leans back into it for your bum, there you go. So now you've got your support. What you'll notice here is Aidan is already in a stood up position. So we've taken out a whole 90 degrees of flexion that he already had when he sat on the floor. This means now you can start to fold into this And now we're going to get this stretch through the hamstrings. It's exactly the same position. It's exactly the same idea, pancake folding, but you're going to be starting from a much reduced or regressed position. So this becomes more appropriate at the very beginning stages of training something like the pancake. Nice. Now, if you want to progress it from here, just walk your feet out a bit more, Aidan. Come out to about here. Lean back into the wall. Good. Fold back in. This again is still just a leaning pancake position, but we're increasing the angle at which we can fold at the hip. We're on a spectrum of the height of our hips going from fully standing to sat on the floor. And as you progress through that spectrum, your flexibility should be improving along the way too. My biggest piece of advice when it comes to knowing when to progress the position of your pancake is when you can get your body to horizontal, so you get to here, and that's your end range of motion, you're getting the best leverage out of this position. So you come back up, you know that you've basically achieved as far as you should get in that position. If I saw Aidan doing that, I'd say, right, okay, it's time to go to a lower position because you're already getting your maximum leverage out of that. So we're gonna go to a lower position. At this point now, Aidan's probably just gonna slide out from underneath him. So we're gonna go to sat on some yoga blocks or sat on something which is lower than his hips are right now. I'm gonna treat the sets and reps of an exercise like this just like a strength exercise. So 3 sets of 6 would be perfect for this. The key thing here is it's a slow tempo exercise. So you're moving into that end range of motion nice and slowly and then pausing there for 1 to 2 seconds before coming out again slowly. An exercise like this can be pretty fatiguing, so you want to take a couple minutes rest in between each set. And a really nice additional part of this exercise which you can add in, which we both like, is holding a 10-second pause at the end of each set.
So we've worked on flexibility, strength throughout the entire range of motion, and now this final exercise will focus entirely on end range.
So to link to the pancake exercise that we just did previously, Aidan's going to go back into a pancake. And we're going to do leg lifts here. So this is strengthening the hip flexors, which is the muscle on the inside of the hip joint, which is going to lift your leg if you're ever trying to place it on a foothold, like lift it up to bring it to a heel hook or a foothold. And I'm going to set Aidan a task to move his heel over a block. So from here to here, and then move it back again. So hands down.
So I'll place my hands down as a bit of a balancing guide.
Nice. So you can see this is really just working at end range, and Aidan's got a calm face on, but he's working pretty hard. But we can challenge him, so make it slightly harder. So we can progress the difficulty of this task by making it the object higher, and let's see if we can max out Aidan's ability. So it's really hard, very small movements. Essentially what we're doing here, you can have a rest now.
It has no place being this hard. It's so difficult.
Essentially what we're doing here is we're training what most people would see as mobility. And when we think of mobility, we think of your ability to use the flexibility you have. And so this is a perfect example of that. Something that I think this exercise illustrates really well is the concept of first developing flexibility before you try and develop the strength in the lifting side of the joint. If you can't sit in this position and start to fold into it, there's absolutely no way you're going to lift your heel off the floor. So I think it makes a lot of sense for anyone that's first starting out, developing flexibility when they're really quite inflexible, is to put most of your time into first developing the flexibility in the hamstrings and the adductors, because that's where it's going to pay off most of all. When you get pretty flexible like Aidan, now we're going to start putting more and more time into exercises like this, which are developing the strength and mobility. I'm not saying that climbers don't need to put effort into training the lifting side of the joint or the mobility aspect of flexibility. I'm just saying that if you're really inflexible to start with, you're going to get way more return on your training by first working on the flexibility than hammering yourself against a brick wall trying to work on the mobility aspect when you just don't have the flexibility for it yet. With this exercise, I'm going to treat it just like a strength exercise as well. So 3 sets of 6 reps is ideal for this. And you can alternate between legs, so you don't need to spend as much time resting.
So the next area we're going to focus on is our shoulders. And obviously there's a vast array of exercises we can do with our shoulders, but we're going to run through just a few which I feel complement this vacuum style of climbing most. So similarly to the hips, a big part of climbing in this way is maintaining our center of mass very close to the wall. So the shoulders play a big role in allowing us to use the holds and pull our chest close to the wall. So today we're going to run through a few exercises which I think help with that.
So the first exercise we're looking at is external rotations of the shoulder. So this is working on the rotator cuff, particularly external rotation. And I think this seated external rotation exercise has been all the craze at the minute because, or at least in part, due to Aidan's silly strength and external rotation. This exercise alone is really good for getting the weight nice and heavy, getting the loads really big, and great for that hypertrophy focus for the external rotator cuff. However, I think Aidan's got a variation on this, which is going to get even more specific for this particular style of climbing, which he uses for those really small holds.
Like Josh is saying, this is a really good exercise, but perhaps due to the levers, most of the force generated by this external rotation is in this bottom range here. And I feel like when we're climbing, really the force which we need to be generating mostly is in this top range here. And obviously gravity is more on your side in this case. And the way we can address that is by moving the rest of our body. So what I've been doing more recently as my training becomes more specific is to focus on this more specific range. And the way we'll do that is do pronated external rotations. Because we're working on our end range of motion, mechanically we're going to be weaker in this range. So whereas a seated rotation you might use a lot more weight, we're going to decrease the weight for these pronated rotations.
So Aidan is in this like a tabletop position, and the bench needs to be supporting his upper arm so that it's really just rotation happening in the humerus and lifting up. I'd also say if you can't get the weight to at least this like vertical position, it's too heavy. You need to drop the weight. So like Aidan said, range of motion is important here. This is obviously appropriate for Aidan, but you might start with quite a bit less weight to first get the range of motion and then progressively build up in that range, getting the weight heavier and heavier. So sets and reps for this exercise, we're probably going to stick to around a 10 rep range for 3 sets. The idea is being slightly higher volume. We really want to develop hypertrophy, more muscle mass in that rotator cuff. The rotator cuff being really important for supporting the shoulder joint.
So it's been quite a long training season for me lately, and building on a solid base and foundation of a lot of these higher rep hypertrophy exercises. I'm now in a phase where I'm looking to focus much more specifically on that maximal strength, and so I'm working on much lower reps of like max strength, and that would maybe entail like 4 sets of 3 reps, like really maximal efforts. So we've addressed shoulder rotation with those exercises. Also, another key component of this style is the retraction of the shoulders as well. So we're going to be showing you an exercise called military press, lying on the floor, which I think focuses on that shoulder retraction quite well.
The shoulder blades should be rotating back and down on your rib cage so that they're coming up and they're squeezing. This is where the mid traps are getting involved. The also nice thing about the floor is it sets the frontal plane of the body. So when you're in this external rotation position, you're tracking the floor with the movement, and that means that you're in this retracted position. So it's a little bit easier to get the form right versus doing it on something like a bench.
Similarly to the external rotation exercises before, I treat the weights the same, and maybe early on in my training phase, in a base phase, I would have much higher reps, maybe 10 rep hypertrophy sets. Whereas now I'm becoming more specific and looking for a performance phase, I would increase the weight and decrease the reps. Inevitably, you can't operate on small crimps with hips and shoulders alone, so finger training is going to come into play, though whereas conventionally people might associate finger training with just jumping on a fingerboard and hanging in an open-handed position and like putting as much load as possible, this is actually going to be a little more nuanced, and we want to focus a little bit on like more acute flexion in our fingers, and that will allow us to generate force away from the wall, whereas in a more open-handed position we have to like stay beneath the holds and like rely more on like opposition made with our body.
A theme you've probably seen running through this whole video is that a lot of these exercises are angle specific or very position specific, and this is no different when it comes to the grip strength training that Aidan's talking about here. So we're talking about this like high angle crimp position. Basically, if you're just training your strength in a 3-finger drag or open 4 position, which often feels strongest for a lot of people, that strength is not going to transfer very well through to these high angle crimp positions. So the training again needs to be angle specific for it to relate to crimping on small edges.
For me right now, most of my training have been done on my board at home, and that is generally very crimpy and will often suffice for my like finger training stimulus. Now for other climbers who maybe don't consistently train on such finger intensive training facilities, might want to consider training this on a fingerboard or off wall, where it's a bit easier to control load and manage volume. So for me personally, I always warm up really thoroughly on a fingerboard in these positions. So I generally will decrease the edge size until the point where I can comfortably hang. I do 2-on hangs, and until I can comfortably hang in like acute flexion down to 8 mils in like front free and like back free full flexion. And at that point I have some peace of mind that my fingers are warm enough so that whatever edge I pull on, I'm not at risk of injuring myself. Now with the analysis of how this kind of movement breaks down and the training associated with each of those individual components, we're here to apply some of that to the wall and kind of bring together all these exercises and coordinate them in a way which is functional for climbing in this vacuum climbing style. As we've said so far, initially when we're holding the holds, in whatever way we hold them, the objective is to generate force away from the wall. So if we can pull away from the wall, our shoulders can then assist us with this rotation and retraction to draw a chest into the wall. And then similarly with strength and flexibility around our hips, we can get our hips closer to the wall. And all of this gets our center of mass underneath the holds, which will essentially make them feel more positive. It allows you to generate a lot of stability in positions, which then in turn allows you to move quite statically between holds, which when you're training on comfy wooden holds like this isn't always a problem, but if you're climbing outside on like in-cut sharp hold where it's quite uneven and you have to be very precise, that's when this style of climbing really comes into its element and you can move really slowly and precisely between all these sharp Crosley crimps. So I also want to caveat that this is not the way to climb. I'm more just encouraging people to consider their natural or favored style and really analyze it and think how the training they do applies to it. Initially think about where their objectives might lie and kind of what they're training for. So is it that they want to get better to do certain problems or do certain things, and then work backwards from there and really consider how the training they do applies to the way they climb and how that aligns with what they want to do.
There you have it. Aidan's top tips for getting the most out of small edges. Now you have absolutely no excuse for not climbing as hard as Aidan Roberts. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.